The laughter started before the cameras even finished rolling. It wasn't nervous laughter or the kind that breaks tension. It was the kind that filled a room with arrogance, a deep, mocking sound that came from a woman who had spent her entire life believing she could never be touched. The audience didn't know it yet, but that laugh would become one of the most replayed sounds in courtroom television history. Karen Mitchell, better known now as Fat Karen, leaned back in her chair and smirked like she was hosting the show, not standing trial in it. The way she looked at Judge Judy, like a parent humoring a clueless child, told everyone in the room that this woman had no idea who she was dealing with. Karen had been the self-appointed queen of Willow Creek Estates for nearly a decade. As head of the local homeowners association, she ruled the neighborhood with the precision of a petty tyrant and the appetite of someone who craved control more than companionship. Her neighbors whispered about her behind closed doors, comparing her to a school principal who never grew out of detention duty, and she loved it. Every letter she mailed, every fine she imposed, every late-night call to code enforcement made her feel important. She wasn't the type to bake cookies for the block party. She was the type to shut it down because the decorations didn't match HOA color guidelines. Today was supposed to be her victory lap. She had dragged one of her neighbors, a soft-spoken woman named Lillian Cortez, into court over what she called willful property damage. The alleged crime? Planting sunflowers. Not in Karen's yard, but in her own. Sunflowers that stood a little too tall, that cast too much shade on the street corner, that offended the sense of uniformity Karen guarded like a religion. It was, by all accounts, ridiculous, and that's exactly why the producers picked it up for national television. They knew an entitled suburban monarch versus Judge Judy was the kind of oil and fire combination that guaranteed views. When Judge Judy entered the courtroom, the atmosphere changed instantly. The murmurs quieted. Even the cameras seemed to steady. Judy didn't need to speak to command respect. Her silence carried decades of authority. But Karen, oblivious to that current, adjusted her cardigan and smiled with performative sweetness. It wasn't respectful. It was condescension dressed as charm. She greeted the judge as if she were introducing herself to a new neighbor, rather than standing before one of the most feared adjudicators in America. "Good morning, Your Honor," Karen said, emphasizing "Your Honor" with a smirk. "I just hope we can get through this quickly. I have a homeowners meeting to attend after this." Judy's expression didn't change. Her voice remained calm, but it had that undercurrent of danger, familiar to anyone who had seen one of her legendary takedowns. "We'll take as long as it takes," she replied. "Why don't you tell me, Mrs. Mitchell, why we're all here today?" Karen straightened her papers, looking every bit the self-styled executive. "Well, Judge, this is a simple matter of respect for community rules," she began. "The defendant knowingly violated our landscaping code despite multiple warnings and has refused to pay her fines. It's about accountability, really." The words rolled off her tongue with practiced ease. She had said them countless times before at HOA meetings where her word was law. She expected this to be no different, another chance to show off her leadership skills. But Judy's gaze didn't blink, didn't waver. She let Karen finish her speech, even nodding slightly as though she was listening intently. And that, more than anything, gave Karen a false sense of confidence. She mistook Judy's patience for approval. The plaintiff, Lillian Cortez, sat quietly, hands clasped in her lap, eyes lowered. You could see the exhaustion on her face, the kind that comes from years of being targeted by someone who thinks rules are weapons. When Judy turned to her and asked softly, "How long has this been going on?" Lillian's voice trembled. "Almost 3 years, Your Honor. I've paid over $8,000 in fines. I tried to comply, but every time I fixed one thing, she found another." The audience shifted. Even the bailiff raised an eyebrow. Karen's eyes darted to the camera, that little flicker of realization that she was losing public sympathy, but she covered it with another smirk. "Some people just don't like rules," she said under her breath. Judy heard it. Everyone heard it. The next few minutes were a masterclass in arrogance. Karen interrupted, argued, and even corrected Judy's interpretation of HOA regulations. The laughter came again, that same ugly, dismissive sound that made the audience collectively recoil. And when Judge Judy leaned forward and gave her first quiet warning, "Mrs. Mitchell, you may want to choose your words carefully," Karen chuckled audibly. That laugh sealed her fate. What she didn't know was that Judy had already seen everything she needed to: the evidence, the documents, even the financial discrepancies in Karen's HOA reports. This wasn't just a petty dispute anymore. It was a loaded gun waiting for the right moment to fire. And Karen, drunk on her own arrogance, had just pulled the trigger herself. If there was one thing Judge Judy had learned after thousands of cases, it was that arrogance always overplays its hand. Karen Mitchell was living proof of that. The moment Judy issued her quiet warning, the entire courtroom felt the shift, everyone except Karen. Most people would have straightened up, taken the hint, maybe softened their tone. But Karen, emboldened by her own delusion of superiority, did the opposite. She leaned back in her chair, crossed her arms, and let out a small laugh that rippled through the silent room like a crack in glass. "Relax, Your Honor," she said, waving one hand dismissively as if brushing off a fly. "You don't have to threaten me. I know how the law works." The bailiff shifted his weight slightly, a subtle sign that he sensed danger. The audience collectively held their breath. Judge Judy didn't react right away. She just watched Karen the way a storm watches a ship, measuring how much longer it will stay afloat before it breaks apart. When she finally spoke, her tone was low, controlled, and unmistakably final. "Mrs. Mitchell," she said, every syllable sharp as a gavel strike, "you may want to choose your words more carefully. I don't issue threats. I issue rulings." But Karen wasn't listening, or perhaps she couldn't. She was too busy, protecting the image she had built for years, the one where she always had the upper hand. To back down now on camera would mean admitting weakness. So she did what every entitled person does when cornered by truth. She doubled down. "I'm sure you do," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "But you can't rule on what you don't understand. HOA law is a little more complicated than small claims, Judge." A collective gasp rolled through the room. Even the cameraman's hands trembled. The air thickened with disbelief. Karen had just implied, on national television, that Judge Judy, the woman who had practiced law longer than Karen had been alive, didn't understand the law. Judy's expression barely changed, but her eyes darkened. That was the look everyone in the audience knew too well, the look that came right before the storm hit. "Mrs. Mitchell," Judy said again, her voice slower this time, more deliberate. "Are you suggesting that I am not qualified to interpret the law?" Karen's smirk widened. "I'm saying HOA matters are specialized. I've been president for 8 years. Most judges don't even know how these communities operate. No offense, but I've read the entire state property code front to back. Twice." Judy didn't respond. She didn't need to. That silence, that long, surgical pause, was enough to make every person in the room squirm. Karen mistook it for hesitation. She leaned forward, pressing the advantage she thought she had. "You see," she continued, tapping the table for emphasis, "this case isn't about feelings or sympathy. It's about maintaining standards. If people like Mrs. Cortez are allowed to do whatever they want, property values go down. It's my job to protect the community, even if that means making tough calls." There was pride in her voice, the same kind of misplaced pride that had destroyed reputations long before hers. She looked around, expecting nods of agreement. Instead, she was met with stony silence. The audience's expressions ranged from shock to disgust. Even Lillian Cortez, who had been trembling just minutes earlier, sat perfectly still now, as if watching the slow, inevitable collapse of her tormentor. Judge Judy exhaled softly and leaned back. Her tone stayed calm, but something in it shifted. The temperature dropped. "You believe your actions are justified, then?" "Absolutely," Karen replied without hesitation. "The law backs me up." "Does it?" Judy asked, almost whispering. The question lingered in the air like smoke. Karen opened her mouth to reply, but Judy raised a hand, a small gesture that silenced her instantly. "Before you continue, I want you to remember something," Judy said. This isn't your neighborhood meeting. This is my courtroom. And when I give you the opportunity to speak, you will take it as a privilege, not a right." The audience erupted in quiet applause. Karen flushed crimson, but forced another laugh. It came out brittle, nervous this time, like glass cracking under too much pressure. She shook her head and muttered just loud enough for the microphones to catch. "Whatever you say, Your Honor. I've dealt with worse threats from my board." That was when Judy leaned forward, her voice low and chilling. "This isn't a threat, Mrs. Mitchell," she said. "It's a guarantee. Keep laughing, and you might find out what happens when the law starts looking into your own records." The color drained from Karen's face. For the first time, a flicker of doubt appeared behind her eyes. But it was too late. The cameras were rolling, and her arrogance had already written the script for her downfall. And in that instant, that one fleeting moment, every person in the courtroom knew Judge Judy wasn't bluffing. The trap had been set. The countdown had begun. Before the cameras, before the courtroom, before the moment her laughter sealed her fate, Karen Mitchell had already been writing the story of her downfall for years. She just didn't know it yet. Power had been her drug, and the Willow Creek Estates HOA was her endless supply. What began as a volunteer position to improve the community quickly evolved into an empire ruled by one woman's insecurities disguised as order. She didn't maintain the neighborhood. She owned it, at least in her mind. And in her world, anyone who resisted deserved punishment. The residents of Willow Creek learned quickly that Karen's smile was a warning, not a welcome. The first to feel her wrath was a retired schoolteacher named Denise Hall. Her crime? Hanging a bird feeder without prior approval. Within a week, Karen mailed 3 violation notices, followed by a $250 fine and a personal visit where she lectured Denise about attracting pests. When Denise tried to reason with her, Karen's tone turned icy. "Rules are rules," she'd said, tilting her head just enough to make it sound like mercy. Denise removed the feeder that same day, but not before word spread through the neighborhood. Everyone now knew. Karen watched everything. Each year her power grew. She rewrote bylaws, replaced board members who disagreed, and instituted a new policy that required residents to request written permission for holiday decorations. She claimed it was to maintain visual harmony. In truth, it was about control. She fined a family $400 for leaving up a pumpkin past November 1st. Another was billed for unsightly laundry visibility when a towel was left drying on a backyard fence. To Karen, these weren't absurdities, they were victories. Every new rule was proof of her dominion. Behind that power, though, was fear. She couldn't stand being ignored. She thrived on submission. When people pushed back, her response was always the same: louder, harsher, and more personal. She didn't just fine people, she embarrassed them. She'd post letters on community bulletin boards with red ink circles highlighting names and offenses. "We hold standards here," she would say at meetings, her voice echoing through the hall while neighbors sat in awkward silence. And then came the Cortez family. Lillian and her husband, Daniel, had moved to Willow Creek 3 years earlier, drawn by its manicured lawns and quiet cul-de-sacs. They were good people, quiet, hard-working, proud of their little yellow house on the corner. Their 2 children, Sophia and Mateo, loved drawing chalk flowers on the driveway. It was innocent, joyful, the kind of thing that made a house a home. But Karen saw color where she wanted conformity. Within days, the Cortezes received their first violation letter: unauthorized pavement markings. The fine was $50, then $100, then $500. Lillian tried to reason with her. She visited Karen's office, a converted spare bedroom filled with binders labeled compliance and infractions. She brought cookies as a peace offering. But the meeting lasted less than 5 minutes. If you wanted to live somewhere without standards, Karen told her, you should have bought a house in a cheaper neighborhood. From that moment on, the Cortez family became her favorite target. She measured their grass, timed their Christmas lights, even photographed their mailbox to prove paint fading. Over 2 years, she issued over 20 citations totaling nearly $8,000 in fines. The money was devastating, but the humiliation was worse. Lillian's kids stopped drawing outside. Daniel stopped attending neighborhood gatherings. People avoided eye contact when the Cortezes passed by, not out of judgment but fear. No one wanted to be next. Karen mistook their silence for victory. She believed she'd won, but what she didn't realize was that every fine, every cruel letter, every smug smile was quietly building a record. And someone had been watching. Judge Judy's research team had spent the night before the trial combing through Karen's history. They found patterns, suspicious spending from HOA funds, overlapping addresses between community accounts and Karen's personal banking. It wasn't enough yet to convict, but it was enough to know something was wrong. When Judy read the summary report that morning, she reportedly muttered a single line to her producer. "She's not a neighborly woman. She's a bully with a balance sheet." In the courtroom, while Karen smugly defended her right to enforce rules, Judy was already connecting dots. The arrogance on display wasn't new. It was a symptom of years spent unchecked. Karen's sense of power had insulated her from consequence. That insulation was about to burn. As Judy reviewed the files in front of her, she saw it all. The arrogance, the cruelty, the meticulous way Karen documented every punishment but never her own actions. It was all there, neatly typed and color-coded like a confession disguised as professionalism. And in that moment, Judy decided she wouldn't just rule on the case. She would make an example. So when Karen laughed again in that courtroom, it wasn't the sound of victory. It was the echo of every cruel laugh she'd ever unleashed on her victims. And soon those echoes were going to come back for her, louder than she could ever imagine. By the time Chapter 4 of Karen Mitchell's life began, the courtroom had transformed into something different. Not just a stage for small claims, but a theater of reckoning. The smugness that once coded her every word was beginning to crack, though she didn't know it yet. She thought the cameras still belonged to her, that the world was watching a woman confidently defending community standards. What she didn't see was how fast the tide had turned. Every viewer, every face in that audience had already chosen sides. Judy wasn't the villain here. She was the storm Karen had been daring to strike her for years. When Judge Judy leaned forward this time, it wasn't with anger. It was with precision. Her tone softened, which somehow made the air heavier. "Mrs. Mitchell," she began, "you've been quite vocal about accountability and responsibility. I admire that. So let's talk about it, shall we?" Karen smiled, mistaking that civility for surrender. "Of course," she said. "Finally, we're on the same page." "Excellent," Judy replied. "Then I'm sure you won't mind helping me understand how your HOA handles its financial reporting." Karen blinked, caught off guard. "Excuse me? Your financial reporting?" Judy repeated, sliding a folder across the bench. "You've referenced community standards and bylaws several times today. I assume you're equally committed to transparency." Karen hesitated, her painted smile faltering for the first time. I don't see how that's relevant, Your Honor." Judy didn't move. Her voice was calm, cold, and steady. The kind of tone that doesn't need to be loud to be terrifying. "It's relevant because you're asking this court to believe that you act in the best interest of your community. That belief depends on your integrity, Mrs. Mitchell, so humor me." Karen's throat tightened. She forced a laugh, hoping to reassert control. "With all due respect, Judge, I'm not on trial here. This is about the defendant's violation, not me." Judy's eyes didn't blink. "Every courtroom reveals more than what's written on the case file," she said. "You'd be amazed how often the person pointing the finger has something to hide." The audience murmured, the words echoing like a verdict in themselves. Karen felt the weight of every eye turning toward her. For the first time, the spotlight felt hostile. She reached for her papers, flipping them as if the right page could rescue her. "If this is some attempt to intimidate me," she started. "Intimidate you?" Judy interrupted, finally letting the steel slip into her tone. "Mrs. Mitchell, intimidation implies I see you as a threat. I don't. I see you as a lesson." That line landed like a gavel. Even the bailiff's lips tightened into the faintest smile. Judy gestured toward the folder again. "Inside, you'll find your HOA's 2022 financial statements. They're public records, or at least they should have been." Karen's pulse quickened. Her fingers twitched, but she didn't touch the folder. She tried to laugh again, but this one died halfway out of her throat. "I don't handle those personally," she stammered. "The treasurer does." "Oh, of course," Judy said smoothly. "That would be your cousin, correct? The one living in Arizona?" Karen froze. Her lips parted, but no words came out. The audience gasped again. Judy's tone didn't change. "You listed her as treasurer. Yet the contact information leads back to your own home address and email. Interesting oversight. Karen's face was drained of color. I can explain that, she said, but Judy raised her hand. No need. I've seen this story before. Power without oversight. Rules for everyone except the one enforcing them. Tell me, Mrs. Mitchell, when did you decide you were above the law you claim to protect? I'm not above. Yes, you are, Judy cut in. You just don't know it yet. The silence that followed was suffocating. You could almost hear the hum of the cameras capturing every detail. The tightening of Karen's jaw, the trembling of her fingers, the widening eyes of the audience. Judy sat back, her voice lowering again into something measured and deliberate. I'm giving you an opportunity, Mrs. Mitchell, right now, to stop digging the hole you're in. Because if you keep talking, we're going to have to open another file. One that doesn't end with a fine, but with a forfeiture. Karen's voice cracked. Are you threatening me? No, Judy said, her eyes sharp as glass. I'm warning you. There's a difference. A threat is based on emotion. A warning is based on evidence. And in this case, the evidence is starting to pile up faster than your arrogance can bury it. The gallery fell utterly silent. Karen didn't realize it. But Judy had just given her the rope she would soon hang herself with. The question was whether she'd recognize it, or keep pulling until the trap snapped shut. As Judy called for a short recess, the cameras cut to Karen's face, still defiant, still clinging to a confidence that was already slipping through her fingers. But behind that fading smirk, a flicker of panic had begun to bloom. The woman who once ruled her neighborhood like a queen had no idea she was standing in her own castle's ruins. When court resumed, the tension was no longer hidden. It was heavy enough to taste. The air buzzed with something electric, that peculiar silence that settles right before a reckoning. Karen Mitchell walked back into the courtroom with a stiffness in her gait, chin still high, but the confident rhythm of her steps was gone. She'd spent the short recess whispering furiously to her assistant off camera, trying to regain control of a situation she didn't even understand yet. Judge Judy sat calm and immovable, eyes on the folder in front of her like a hunter waiting for her prey to walk into view. When the cameras turned back on, Judy didn't waste a second. Mrs. Mitchell, she began, voice measured but sharp. During our break, I had my clerk review the HOA's most recent filings. I'd like to read something aloud. Karen stiffened, eyes narrowing. Your Honor, I fail to see why my association's paperwork is being dragged into. Sit down, Judy said, her tone cutting like glass. Karen froze mid-sentence, then slowly lowered herself into the chair. The gallery erupted in soft, nervous laughter. Judy continued, flipping through the folder with deliberate slowness. It says here that you've been the acting HOA president for 8 consecutive years. That's impressive. Must take a lot of trust from your neighbors. Karen tried to smile again. Yes, Your Honor, it does. I've always worked hard to— And yet, Judy interrupted, there's a curious pattern here. She adjusted her glasses and began reading from the document. Annual landscaping budget $12,400. She turned the page. Vendor Greenleaf Maintenance Services payment routing to an account ending in 47-12. She paused and looked directly at Karen. Would you like to explain why that account also happens to belong to your personal checking? The audience gasped. Even the bailiff's eyebrows lifted. Karen's hands twitched on the table. That's a mistake, she stammered. There must be some mix-up. Judy didn't blink. A mix-up that's occurred 4 years in a row, she said. Because, according to the statements, your association has paid over $50,000 to that same account, under the label, Community Improvements. She leaned forward slightly. What kind of improvements were you making, Mrs. Mitchell? New playgrounds? Better lighting? Or perhaps a few personal luxuries? Karen swallowed hard. You're twisting things. That's not what— I'm reading your own financial records, Judy cut in. If they're twisted, you're the one who wrote them that way. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Cameras zoomed in on Karen's face. Her jaw clenched, her eyes darting side to side, searching for a lifeline that wasn't there. Judy didn't let up. Tell me something, she said. Do your neighbors know about this? The same people you've been fined for unauthorized decorations and grass height violations. Do they know you've been using their money to fund your personal accounts? That's not true, Karen's voice cracked. I've dedicated my life to that community. I've worked— Save it, Judy snapped. Your community didn't ask you to play dictator with their wallets. You used authority as a shield for greed, and now that shield's full of holes. Karen's face flushed crimson. She opened her mouth again, but Judy raised a hand. Don't. Every time you speak, you remind us that this isn't about law, it's about ego. And if there's one thing I can't stand more than dishonesty, it's arrogance wrapped in self-righteousness. The audience broke into light applause before the bailiff silenced them with a glare. Judy waited for quiet, then continued, her voice lower but somehow even more dangerous. I've seen people like you, Mrs. Mitchell. You think because you run a small neighborhood you understand justice. But justice isn't a rule book. It's a mirror. And today it's finally facing you. Karen's breathing quickened. Her hand trembled as she tried to shuffle her papers, desperate to project control. But Judy wasn't finished. She flipped one more page. And here's the most interesting part, she said. A transfer of $8,900 labeled maintenance reimbursement was sent to your name. One day after you issued a fine to Mrs. Cortez for the same amount. Coincidence? Karen's voice was barely a whisper. I don't remember that. Oh, I bet you don't, Judy said. But the receipts do. The courtroom fell completely silent. Judy leaned back, her expression unreadable. Mrs. Cortez, she said, turning toward the defendant, how long did you say you've lived under this woman's rule? 3 years, Your Honor, Lillian said softly. And in those 3 years, how much have you paid in fines? Almost $9,000. Judy nodded slowly, then turned back to Karen. Isn't that fascinating? She said. The exact amount down to the dollar. You took this woman's peace, her savings, and her dignity, and turned it into a payday. Karen tried to speak, but her voice broke. Don't lie to me, Judy snapped. You lied to them long enough. You stole from the people who trusted you, and you laughed while doing it. But the difference between you and me, Mrs. Mitchell, is that I don't need to raise my voice to end your story. The truth does that for me. The silence that followed was absolute. Karen sat frozen, eyes glassy, as if she'd just realized the walls were closing in. Judy tapped the folder once sharply as if punctuating the moment. We'll be discussing restitution next, she said. But for now, consider this your wake-up call. The audience didn't cheer this time. They just watched, some in awe, others in quiet satisfaction, as the Queen of Willow Creek finally met a judge she couldn't overrule. And for the first time in her life, Karen Mitchell had no rules left to hide behind. The moment Judy finished speaking, the courtroom seemed to freeze in time. Every camera stayed trained on Karen Mitchell's face, waiting for the reaction that was about to define her forever. Her lips trembled as she searched for words, but none came. The arrogance that had been her armor for so many years was cracking in real time, piece by piece, as the weight of humiliation and fear set in. Her shoulders sagged, her breathing turned shallow. She looked around the courtroom, not for help, but for belief. For anyone, even one person who might still see her as right. But no one did. The people who once nodded at her HOA meetings were gone. In their place sat a silent audience, eyes fixed on her downfall. For years, Karen had used silence as a weapon. She would let others talk themselves into fear, let them fill the room with apologies while she stood there with her arms folded, pretending to be calm. Now that same silence was her punishment. It swallowed her, suffocating her in the space between her guilt and her pride. Finally, she snapped. You think you know me? She shouted, voice shaking, eyes wet. You think this paper means anything? I've worked for that community. I've spent years keeping that place from falling apart while everyone else complained. Judy didn't flinch. Her hands rested lightly on the desk, eyes locked on Karen with that calm, clinical precision that made her verdicts feel inevitable. Mrs. Mitchell, she said evenly, this is not about effort. It's about ethics. And from where I'm sitting, yours have long since been evicted. The courtroom gasped again and Karen's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Her defiance faltered. She looked down at her trembling hands, then at the folder in front of her, the same folder that had just undone her. Slowly, she shook her head, whispering almost to herself. You don't understand. They all hated me. They wanted me to fail. They set me up. Judy's voice softened slightly, but the words still cut. The only person who set you up, Mrs. Mitchell, is the one in your reflection. That line shattered whatever composure Karen had left. Her body slumped as tears filled her eyes. This isn't fair, she muttered, half to Judy, half to herself. I kept order. I kept things perfect. Perfect for whom? Judy asked quietly. You call it order. The people who lived under you call it oppression. She leaned forward just slightly. You spent years punishing good people for living their lives. And the irony is that you were the one breaking the law the entire time. Karen tried to speak, but her words came out as choked fragments. You don't know what it's like. No one respects you unless you make them. No one listens. Judy's reply came like a final gavel strike. Respect isn't something you demand, Mrs. Mitchell, it's something you earn. And once you lose it, you can't buy it back. Not with fines, not with fear, and certainly not with fraud. The audience sat in utter stillness. Even the air seemed afraid to move. And then slowly Karen broke. Her chin quivered. Her lips trembled. She covered her face with both hands, sobbing quietly. The cameras zoomed in. The once mighty HOA queen was now a portrait of ruin. Judy waited a moment before speaking again. Her voice was calm, deliberate, heavy with finality. Mrs. Mitchell, your arrogance cost this community their trust. It cost families their peace. But now it's about to cost you something much more tangible. She glanced at the clerk. Please read into the record the official notice from the state's attorney's office. The clerk stood, voice steady as she read. Due to discovery of fraudulent misappropriation of community funds exceeding $40,000, assets associated with Willow Creek HOA are to be seized pending further investigation. The presiding officer, Mrs. Karen Elizabeth Mitchell, is hereby subject to forfeiture proceedings regarding any property acquired with said funds. Karen's hands fell from her face. Her eyes widened. No, that's not. Judy cut in, her tone as cold as winter steel. It is. 5 minutes ago you were laughing at this court. Now you'll watch everything you built crumble in the same amount of time. She gestured toward the clock on the wall. 5 minutes. That's all it takes for arrogance to turn into ashes. Karen's mouth opened in horror, but her words failed her again. She tried to rise, but her knees buckled. The bailiff moved closer, gently but firmly keeping her seated. The audience, still silent, watched as the woman who had terrorized her neighborhood for nearly a decade finally understood what real accountability looked like. 5 minutes. That was all it took. The first minute, denial. The second, anger. The third, pleading. The fourth, collapse. And by the fifth, silence. Not the kind she once used to intimidate others, but the kind that comes when a life built on control finally loses its foundation. When it was over, Judy leaned forward and spoke softly, not for the cameras, but for Karen. You wanted to be the law in your neighborhood, she said. Now you've met the real one. The clock ticked once more and the courtroom faded to black, leaving only the echo of Karen's broken sobs behind. The next morning, the headline spread like wildfire. Judge Judy's most ruthless verdict yet. HOA president loses everything. Clips of the previous day's courtroom meltdown flooded every corner of the internet. The video of Karen's laughter, her arrogance, and the precise moment it turned into tears had already reached millions. But inside that courtroom where it all began, the story wasn't over yet. When Karen returned to court, she looked like a shadow of the woman from the day before. Her makeup was gone, her hair tied back loosely, her voice small. She carried a folder under her arm, though everyone knew there was nothing left inside it that could save her. The once Queen of Willow Creek sat in silence as Judge Judy entered the room, her gavel tapping lightly against the desk. Mrs. Mitchell, Judy began, voice calm but heavy. This court has reviewed the evidence in full, including financial records and testimony provided by the state auditor. You were found to have diverted community funds for personal use over several years. The total amount of misappropriated money exceeds $48,000. Do you have anything to say before I deliver the ruling? Karen hesitated. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for someone, anyone who might speak on her behalf. No one did. Even the audience that once found her amusing now looked at her with quiet disdain. Her voice came out thin, trembling. I didn't mean to steal. I just borrowed. I was going to fix it. Judy's tone didn't soften. Borrowing requires consent. You didn't have it. You took what wasn't yours and you used it to feed an illusion of control. Now the law will take what it must to restore that balance. Karen lowered her head. Her fingers gripped the edge of the table like she could hold herself together by force alone. Judy continued, reading from the ruling document. As of this judgment, the state will seize all assets proven to be purchased or maintained with misused funds. This includes vehicles, savings accounts, and real estate holdings registered in your name. Karen's head snapped up, eyes wide. My house? Judy didn't hesitate. Yes. The property at 214 Willow Creek Lane will be forfeited and sold to repay damages owed to the community fund and affected residents. You abused your position, Mrs. Mitchell. Now that position is gone. The words struck her like a physical blow. She swayed slightly and the bailiff stepped forward, steadying her as her breathing quickened. You can't do this, she whispered. That's my home. I built it. Judy looked down at her over the rim of her glasses. No, Mrs. Mitchell, she said. You built it with other people's money and their misery. You don't own that house. You rented it from your victims. The silence that followed was the kind that lives forever in memory. Karen's face went pale. She looked at the ground, blinking through tears. Somewhere in the back of the courtroom, Lillian Cortez sat with her hands clasped, watching the moment justice finally arrived. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply closed her eyes and exhaled, as if years of tension had finally lifted from her shoulders. Judy continued, her tone softer now, but not merciful. I could impose fines, even probation, but none of that will teach you what you refuse to learn. Losing your home isn't punishment, Mrs. Mitchell. It's perspective. For once you'll know what it feels like to live without power. Karen let out a strangled sob. Please, she said, don't take everything. I was trying to make it right. I made mistakes, but Judy raised a hand to stop her. Everyone makes mistakes, but arrogance turns mistakes into crimes. And you, Mrs. Mitchell, made a career out of them. The gavel came down once, sharp, final, unflinching. This court orders immediate forfeiture of the property. Case closed. The sound echoed through the courtroom like a closing door. Karen stayed frozen for a moment, staring ahead as if her body refused to accept the reality her mind already knew. Then slowly she stood. The bailiff guided her out quietly as the cameras followed. She didn't look back at the audience, didn't look toward Judy. Her steps were heavy, the steps of a woman walking out of her own life. Outside, reporters swarmed, microphones thrust toward her face. Mrs. Mitchell, do you have any comments? Do you regret your actions? What will you do now? She didn't answer. She kept walking past the flashing lights, the questions, the noise. Every word of her downfall had already been written. Every headline, every replay, every judgment. By the time she reached the courthouse steps, she stopped and looked up at the sky. The cameras caught her face, swollen eyes, trembling lips, just as she whispered something no one could hear. Some said it was, I'm sorry, others said it was, it's over. But those words didn't matter. What mattered was what came next. The neighborhood she once ruled met that evening for the first time without her. The new HOA board voted unanimously to dissolve her policies, refund wrongfully charged fees, and dedicate a park bench in the community garden to the people she'd mistreated. Not in her honor, but as a reminder. A plaque beneath it read, "Power means nothing if it costs your humanity." And somewhere across town, in a small rented apartment she never imagined she'd call home, Karen Mitchell sat alone, staring at an eviction notice and the echo of her own laughter. The same laugh that had once filled a courtroom, and now haunted her like a ghost she could never silence. The story of Karen Mitchell didn't end with a gavel strike. It began there. Within hours of Judge Judy's ruling, the clip had gone viral across every platform imaginable. News anchors dissected it, commentators replayed it, and millions of viewers across the country watched one woman's arrogance collapse under the weight of truth. The hashtags were Judge Judy Justice and Warho Karen trended for days. People who had never heard of Willow Creek Estates now knew every detail of its fallen ruler. But beneath the noise, something deeper stirred. A collective satisfaction that justice, real justice, still meant something. Back in Willow Creek, life began to breathe again. For the first time in years, neighbors greeted one another without fear of violation letters or hidden cameras. The fences that had divided them started to come down, literally and figuratively. Lillian Cortez planted new sunflowers in her front yard, their golden heads swaying in the morning light. The children returned to the sidewalks, drawing chalk flowers where warnings had once been posted. There was laughter again, but this time it was free. Not cruel, not loud, just human. The board meetings that used to feel like interrogations turned into gatherings. People shared stories, food, and plans for community improvements that didn't come with threats or fines. And in the center of the neighborhood's small park, beneath an oak tree that had stood long before Karen's reign, sat a new wooden bench. On it was a small brass plaque that read, "Power means nothing if it costs your humanity." It wasn't a message for the residents. It was a warning to anyone who might try to follow in her footsteps. Meanwhile, far from Willow Creek, Karen Mitchell's life became quieter, painfully so. The woman who once filled rooms with her voice now lived in near silence. The eviction had been swift. Her house was listed and sold within weeks. Proceeds divided to repay the community fund. She moved into a small apartment on the edge of town, its walls thin, its furniture borrowed. The first night she slept there, she could still hear the echo of her own voice, that mocking laugh that had sealed her fate, bouncing in her mind like a cruel memory she couldn't shut off. Days passed, then weeks. Reporters stopped calling. The world moved on to newer scandals, fresher stories. But the internet never forgets. Every time she opened her phone, her face stared back, frozen mid-laugh in 1,000 memes. Her downfall replayed in countless compilations titled, "The Moment She Realized." The sound of her own laughter had become her punishment. One morning, she drove past her old neighborhood. The streets were alive again. Children played where she once enforced silence. Lillian was in her garden, trimming her sunflowers. Karen slowed her car but didn't stop. For a moment, their eyes met. Lillian didn't glare, didn't smirk. She simply nodded once, a silent acknowledgement that the past was over. Karen nodded back, her hands tightening around the steering wheel, then drove away without a word. Later that night, she sat alone at her kitchen table, staring at a stack of unopened mail. For the first time in her life, there were no forms to sign, no meetings to schedule, no rules to enforce, just silence and the faint flicker of remorse. She whispered to herself, almost like a prayer, "Maybe it's time I start over." It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't redemption. But it was the first honest thing she'd said in years. As for Judge Judy, she never commented publicly on the case. When asked in an interview weeks later about the viral clip, she only smiled and said, "Sometimes justice doesn't need to shout. It just needs to be seen." That line became the quote everyone remembered, carved into the final frame of every re-upload, printed on shirts, turned into captions. Because in that moment, Judge Judy reminded the world that truth still had a voice, even in an age where arrogance often gets the microphone. And that's what made this story more than just entertainment. It was a reminder that entitlement, no matter how powerful it feels, eventually collapses under the weight of its own lies. That silence, when earned through humility, can speak louder than laughter born of cruelty. So if you've ever been on the wrong end of someone like Karen, someone who used power as a weapon, remember this story. Because sometimes the loudest justice isn't the one that roars in anger, but the one that whispers in truth. If this story made you believe again in justice that actually means something, hit the like button right now. Drop a comment with the word truth, and don't forget to subscribe. Because stories like this remind us that arrogance can make noise, but integrity always makes history.